Thank you. This morning's platform is Climate Action, Why Collective Action is the Answer, with Saad Amer. Saad is an environmentalist, activist, and founder of Plus One Vote, an organization dedicated to improving voter turnout and improving representation in our democracy. The organization rallies voters on issues like climate change and reached millions of Americans in the 2018 midterms. Saad works with the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change's Youth Constituency and is an expert reviewer for the upcoming IPCC report and is an advisor to the National Parks Conservation Association on their Next Generation Advisory Council. He has worked on environmental issues in India, China, and the United States, co-created Harvard University's inaugural sustainability plan, and discovered a new hybrid species in French Polynesia. He has organized and educated hundreds of K through 12 students at Fish Thicket Land Preserve in New York and has worked with Brookhaven's National Laboratory. He attended Harvard University, where he studied environmental science and public policy with a minor, I wanted to read this as orgasmic, organismic and evolutionary biology. Saad Amer, thank you.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction, and happy birthday. Oh. Together we rise. So everyone, thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here. Climate change is something that I've been working on since I was in high school. You know, we see all these climate strikers these days, and I'm really excited to see their sort of passion and enthusiasm in the way that this movement has really caught on all across this country and all around the world. For me, I kind of used climate and the environment as my sort of foray into this more politicsy space. So Plus One Vote is an organization dedicated to getting out the vote on issues like climate change, like equality, like social justice. And for me, when I was in the environment for so long, working all around the world on all these issues, but what I saw was that there was a failure on a global level to really actually address the fundamental root of these issues. And so I kind of was thinking about what can I do? What can we do collectively to make some sort of impact and change on this? I think when it comes to climate, we often focus on individual action. So you know, you got your plastic straws, no more. You got your plastic bags, no more. You know, you got your sustainable fashion and all of these things that are essential, that we all need to embrace in our individual lives. But we often neglect to take that and scale that up in a way that really can have transformative change and impact. And so the sort of ethos behind me founding Plus One Vote is the idea that when we vote, we can create this change on a systematic level. For far too long, we have had our politicians make promise after promise after promise, Paris Accord this and climate tax that, and what have you guys seen? Really, what have you seen? And so for me, when we look at climate, I'm an expert reviewer for the upcoming IPCC report. The IPCC is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. This is the sort of leading organization that dictates the science and makes the policy recommendations across the world. In 2007, they won a Nobel Prize in conjunction with Al Gore for their work in bringing together different stakeholders to really thoroughly look at this climate issue. And so according to the IPCC, we need to reduce our carbon emissions almost by half by 2030. Now, growing up and hearing these sorts of figures, it was sort of like, oh, you know, it'll happen. Someone will do it. It'll come, the change will come. And now we're, you know, literally in a week, it's 2020. And yeah, like what is really happening? And so we're at the point where it now is going to be essential to each year going through the 2020s to reduce globally carbon emissions by 7.5% every single year. 7.5% every year. And so when we talk about the need for climate action now, we've been saying that for decades. And we've kind of gone beyond the point where we can just sort of slowly rev up our ambitions and have sort of small changes here and there. We're beyond that. We truly need transformative change if we're actually going to be able to do 7.5% every year. That's a lot. That is truly a lot. And what we see is we're sort of baked into this system where we are consuming beyond the planetary boundaries, right? So when we think about sustainability, and sustainability is kind of a broad word. We use it in all sorts of different contexts: sustainable fashion, sustainable business markets, sustainable development. For me, the definition that I go by for sustainability, and this is sort of as my benchmark when looking at all of these sorts of different sort of sectors of society. Sustainability is ensuring that we can deal with the needs of the people now without taking away from the needs of future generations, without taking away from the ability of future generations to meet their own needs, right? So anything that we're doing now that is harming people in the future, that is not sustainable. Our overconsumption of fossil fuels, that is not sustainable, because that is going to have, and is already having, immensely negative impacts on future generations. And right now, the way the system is pollution is profitable. It is very profitable to go out there, drill for oil, make your coal mine, and just sort of expand this globally in a way that really disservices so many people, but there's no accountability, right? So you kind of have the ability to go out there, drill, pollute. We're seeing these global impacts of climate change, increasing temperatures, rising sea levels, floods, droughts, species extinction. It's just, it keeps going. And where is the accountability? Who does that responsibility lie on? Does it belong to the polluters who are sort of forcing this system and complicit in a system that they're pushing forward? Is it on governments that are supposed to be changing society and are supposed to be addressing the needs of all of us? Is it on the people? Are we supposed to do this in our own lives? And so you have all these different sectors of society that need this system to work. They need a working system, but right now it's very clear that it doesn't. And right now it's very clear that we need to do something on this because we are on the verge of ecological breakdown. You know, we are seeing all across the United States all of these impacts, and yet nothing. You know, I'm from Long Island, so just came on the Long Island Railroad this morning. Nice to see you. And you know, best case scenario is that by 2100, in 80 years, we will have 1 to 3 feet of sea level rise. And you know, that will sort of obliterate a lot of the seafront property. You know, we have all these nice fancy homes in the Hamptons, no more. We will just see all of these people from the island, from my hometown, are gonna have to move and evacuate from where they are somewhere else. Where's that plan? Have you seen anything? I haven't. You know, we saw Hurricane Sandy, and that had absolutely catastrophic impacts here in New York. We saw a record storm surge. We saw impacts to the subways that just went on and on and on top of an already broken subway, like y'all. And you know, for me, when I was, and that's sort of on a broader framework from that sort of scientific level. And when I was graduating from college, I graduated from Harvard in 2016, I wanted to do something about this. I wanted to be on the ground in these communities that are being impacted by climate change and really figure out, like, what's going on? How is this actually impacting people, and what can be done about it? So I hopped on a plane and flew to India, and I was working in the Himalayas in a city called Darjeeling, where the tea comes from. It is delicious. Definitely a perk. And so I was working with ATREE, the Ashoka Trust for Research in Ecology and the Environment, and I was working with these 30 remote villages scattered beyond the sort of city center of Darjeeling. And so some were super remote, there would be no proper roads to get to them, couldn't take a car, you just sort of have to hike for miles on end to reach these small communities, villages with anywhere from 20 to 100 households, so very small. And these communities were reliant on agriculture. So, that's just how they had their farming. If they were able to have any sort of surplus, they would sell it in the town, and that was sort of their economic system. And so, of course, there were some people with different tasks, but on the whole, that was how it was. And so, the impacts of climate change, when we talked about all that IPCC stuff, it's sort of with this idea of we need to establish a world with a 1.5 degree limit in warming by 2050. That 1.5 degree number is an average. So you'll have some places that have less warming and some places that have a lot more warming. And that change in temperature and that change in climate affects the most extreme regions of the world first. And so what's more extreme than the Himalayas, right? And so what we were seeing there is that in India, there are these, and a lot of Asia, there are monsoon rains, these sort of strong, intense rains seasonally, so there's like winter, summer, fall, autumn, and also a monsoon season kind of baked in there. And what we're seeing as a result of climate change is that these monsoon rains are becoming incredibly more severe. And so, I would literally be there hiking from place to place and just boom, a sudden outpour of rain to the point where it almost felt like I was walking in a pool. There was just kind of a wall of water surrounding me. And these rains have become more frequent, they have become more intense, and they have had all sorts of impact to the ecology there. And so what it's ended up doing is now you have intense flooding during the monsoon season, as well as drought during other parts of the year. So you can kind of get the worst in terms of how the water is being distributed across the year. In addition, because of the rains, where the soil of the actual Himalayas in certain areas is becoming looser. So not only is this more difficult for the agriculture, for the people there, for the people who rely on the agriculture there for their lives, it is also resulting in landslides. And so a personal example, I was walking across one of these roads, and I was on the edge, sort of taking a picture of some mountains, very beautiful scenery. You could see Everest in the distance and Kanchenjunga on the other side, which is the world's third tallest mountain. Absolutely beautiful. As I'm taking this photo, the ground beneath me collapses. Yeah, and I fall about 3 stories, scratch up my entire back, and was terrified. And so as I'm sort of falling in this landslide, I'm just like hoping to be alive, not knowing how far it'll go or when it'll stop. Thankfully, it was not that bad. And my camera was fine, thanks for asking. But, and that was just my own impact. Another day, a few months later, as I was walking down, you can see almost scars on the mountain, where there would be this rich biodiversity and all these mountains of beautiful forestry. And then you would just see sort of marks of brown, just long stretches from these landslides. And I saw one that had taken a building. And so I asked one of the locals that I was with, what happened over there? What's that? And he told me there was a landslide there last week. It had hit a school when it was in session, one of the few schools in the community there, in these small rural communities, and 4 kids died. And not only is that tragic, these are children trying to get an education. These are in remote villages that really had such minimal impact on the climate catastrophe to begin with. And yet they are facing the brunt of the impacts now in a way that no one's talking about, right? No one's talking about what's happening over there to these small remote communities. No one's even talking about, the large disenfranchisement of Muslims across India, millions of them, because of in a current immigration crisis that sort of broke this week. And so we're seeing just a sort of global failure to not only act, but also report on these fundamental issues all across the world. And so as I'm living there, I am sort of like baffled by what is happening in the United States. You see a change in administration, and suddenly there's all this talk of a Muslim ban, and of potentially getting out of the Paris Accord, and this person potentially going to the EPA. And I was just like, my work here is important, learning about the communities here, researching the communities here, and helping install programs of sustainable agriculture to help these people meet their daily needs and become more financially sustainable in their own lives. But at the same time, those sorts of programs need to scale up, and that can only happen when there is large-scale policy intervention. And it was clear that the United States was going in the opposite direction. So, got back on a plane, came back here, and this is why I founded Plus One Vote. For me, it was sort of this ethos of, if we can bring people out to the polls, we can bring about the change that we need to see. And as we've seen in America these past couple of years, I've been astonished at the level of harm that one administration can cause. We have seen rollback after rollback on the Clean Water Act, on the Clean Car Rules, on methane emissions, on the Endangered Species Act, things that they weren't even controversial, right? Like, no one was saying let's reduce the sort of regulations from the Endangered Species Act, besides a very small group of corporations who have an incentive to, again, pollute to make profit, even if it's at the expense of these creatures and of the nature and environment that we all depend on. And, even as there's been a clear violation of ethics, here we are at the Ethical Society, and now there's ethical investigation after impeachment hearing, after this trial, after that in Congress. What's clear is that even as these processes go forward, even as people like former head of the EPA, Scott Pruitt, are removed, the policies still stay in place. Whatever it is that he's rolled back, it's gone. There's no undo button for that, beyond getting new people in office who will actually implement changes, or at the very least stop these sorts of things from going backward. And so, and it's like the closest thing that we've sort of come globally to really taking action on this is the Paris Accord. Everyone familiar? Who's familiar with the Paris Accord? Yeah. Lovely, you guys are my people. When the Paris Agreement happened, I was in college, and it was sort of this hallmark, landmark agreement. All my professors in the environmental department were like ecstatic. We were like, Obama saved the world, like, here we are. And in my work with the UN, what I found consistently is that even beyond the United States, there has just been a global failure to deliver on the expectations of the Paris Accord. So in the Paris Accord, you have NDCs, these nationally determined contributions. This is sort of the climate action plan of each nation and what they're supposed to present and what they're supposed to do so we can reach these larger benchmark goals of the Paris Accord. And the Climate Summit, which I'm sure many of you saw recently in September, I had the opportunity to be there and present, so thank you to the world. Nation after nation, the goal of this summit was to rev up their ambitions. But it was almost laughable to see how little ambition was actually coming from these nations. And I went up on the stage and I was sort of saying to these ambassadors and parliament members from all across the world and just questioned, why do we have such mediocre leadership? Why don't we have people that are willing to take a stand? And kind of harsh for some of them to hear that. But at the same time, there are every now and then a few people who really latch onto that. The ambassador to Costa Rica was like, high five, like you go. And Costa Rica is a nation that it is currently on about 95% renewable energy. And so this is possible. All of this stuff is possible. But we're just not really seeing anything happen. And even at that level, as we're talking about these ambitions, so many things go silenced. So to me, one of the most striking numbers in all of this is that by 2050, if we can reach the 2-degree warming target, so you'll hear 1.5 degree or 2-degree warming target. So it was 2 degrees, and then now they want it to be more ambitious, they 1.5 degrees. You'll kind of hear both. That under that target, the aspirational target, there will be at least 200 million climate refugees. Climate refugees. So the idea being that a refugee is someone who can't really live where they're living, whether it's war-torn or there's immense levels of poverty or disenfranchisement or whatever it is. They have to leave where they are, usually desperate circumstances, and go somewhere else and seek refuge. Refugee. And the climate catastrophe, having all of these impacts around the world, there are places that are just going to become uninhabitable. Immense drought means that people can't grow their food. Same when it comes to flooding. People will literally and have literally lost their homes. We're seeing some places, was it Oman in the Middle East, that over the summer there was not a day, even at nighttime, where the temperature went under 100 degrees. Like, can you imagine just living in this truly excruciating type of circumstance? And a lot of these changes are that we're seeing in climate are being met by these sort of changes in industry and in culture, but not in a way that's actually addressing the root of the climate change, but is instead, oh, it's hot, let's add in some more air conditioners, and we need more electricity to meet those, and it's sort of this feedback loop, and will only continue to get worse globally until we finally jump in and take that action. And even when we see, like literally a week or two ago, the COP25. So this is the Conference of Parties, and this is sort of the annual meeting that they have with the UNFCCC and other UN and NGO and government stakeholders to address climate. COP21 is where the Paris Accord was formed and signed, and so this was COP25, the next iteration 4 years later. And even the Secretary General of the United Nations, the head of the United Nations, declared that it was a failure. What we're seeing is that when nations are coming together, they're not becoming more ambitious and revving up their policies. No, instead, they are sort of negotiating loopholes. Yeah. And when you have sort of systems that are sort of perpetuating what we already have and we already know does not work, how can we expect change? And when we look at sort of climate change, we see that democracy has sort of failed us so far in really addressing this. And that's because we are not having representation at the level that we need of constituents of countries going in, and we're not seeing accountability from leaders actually coming in and making the changes that we all know, that they even know, that we need to make. And so there's sort of this, and it's sort of like, why does this keep happening, right? Like administration after administration, Congress after Congress. Why? What are we doing wrong? We all believe in this. We're all in this together. But what we see in sort of the way we have our election cycles is there are these politicians that are motivated by 2-4-year deadlines of their terms and are constantly thinking, above all, the most important thing is to get reelected, and will do and say and meet with anyone who will make sure that that happens, even if it's at the expense of the people, even if it's at the expense, long-term, of the generations that are begging them in the streets to make change. And we have policies out there like the Green New Deal. I'm sure we've all heard, very ambitious policies that want to change infrastructure and provide jobs and electrify the grid and do all of these great ambitious things. And we have a lot of support from that in the House of Representatives, none from the Senate. And the irony of this is this actually happened 10 years ago with the American Clean Energy and Securities Act in 2009 under Obama. It was sort of the same setup of the government, went through Congress, went through the House of Representatives, was blocked at the Senate, and there was no change. And so it makes me wonder, is this a cycle? In 10 years, are we going to be having the same conversation about some new climate policy that everyone is excited about, but with leaders who don't have the courage to do something about this? When we, and it's sort of like no other country is really like this. America is sort of unique in the way that even our election cycle it's just kind of gone on and on and on. Like here I am talking about voting, which of course we need to, but like the election's next year, right? If you look at like a country like France, their election cycle is like kind of 2 months. It just starts and it ends, and people go on with their lives. But here we are now, just sort of seeing rally after rally and people promoting politicians rather than implementing change. And when we have that sort of discrepancy between what people are supposed to be doing and just trying to constantly push that forward. And it's, of course, I understand the need for politicians to promote their policies and promote their candidacy, but at the same time, it can't come at the expense of other necessary changes. And so it's sort of, in 2020, a lot is at stake, right? It's climate change, climate policy is at stake. The right to choose for women is at stake. The equality and representation of people of color is at stake. Gun rights are at stake. Healthcare is at stake. So much is at stake in this election. And so if we don't show up and vote, it's not going to happen. Nothing's going to change. And I think when we talk about that individual action, the biggest contribution that we can have is not only to vote, but to bring someone to vote with you. Is not only to register, but to register someone with you, your +1. And so my organization has been focusing on rallying people, on giving people the tools and the resources to be able to do this in their own lives. So if you were to literally go onto plusonecampaign.org/register, this is the easiest thing. It's literally a form that you can give anyone on your phone and just be like, hey, register right here. And put in your name, your zip code. In 2 minutes, whoever it is will be registered. It's not hard, but we are the ones who have to do the work. In a democracy, the people are the government. The people are the ones who decide. And so when we're seeing this level of inaction globally, it is up to us to work in our own communities, to inspire our communities, our friends, our families, our neighbors, to go out and take action, to become not just people complaining in the streets about what happened in yesterday's democratic debate, no, but to instead take that responsibility upon ourselves and make the change that we wish to see in the world. Justice is not imminent. Justice is not just going to happen. We have to decide that justice happens. And then, and only then, will we see this sort of transformative change across society. But if we don't take that upon ourselves, change is not going to come. And when looking at 2020, people often ask me, Saad, do you think we're going to win? Are things going to change? What's going to happen? And my response is, act like things aren't going to change. If things weren't going to change, and you knew that they weren't going to change in advance, what would you do? What would you have done differently in 2016? Now is the time to take that action to ensure that change actually happens. We can't be complicit and complacent in assuming that this is just gonna happen, that we're seeing these strikers and these marches happen. We have to take that energy and transform it into a march to the polls, into something that can transformatively change society. Because when I think back to those 4 kids in that school in India, they did not deserve the fate that they had in that landslide. They did not. And we're seeing more and more that those same impacts are happening in the United States, floods in the Midwest, hurricanes in Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico. We're seeing wildfires day after day after day in California. Oprah's house was on fire. This is just real and on the scale that it's really affecting everyone at all levels of society. And so I implore you all to take action on this. And how you can work with my organization, +1 Vote, is become a member, join. You can go on our website, plusonecampaign.org/join, and
Repeat that slowly.
+1 campaign, 1 the number 1, .org. And there you'll find a whole bunch of resources. You'll find the ability to easily register people. You'll find a whole bunch of voter resources in terms of, as a young person, I think a response I often hear from my friends and my peers is, but Saad, I don't know enough about voting. I don't know what's happening at the government on the local level and everything. I'm just not informed. And my response is, do you think they are? Some are. We know you are. And then there are just, a lot of people who go out and I don't think you have to know everything about every issue to be a voter. I think that, for me, my biggest issue is climate change. I want to know who's doing what on climate, and for me, that will decide who I end up voting for in the primary and in the election. And so there you can find those resources. We have all sorts of information for how you can see what your ballot looks like. You can donate to help us grow this movement. And as we go into 2020 and really scale up our ambitions, we want to get hundreds of thousands of people registered to vote in swing states, and especially among young people. We could literally be the defining demographic for what happens in policy across the United States forever. But it's all about turnout. And so, we're seeing this sort of idea of a swing voter is not just somebody who is going from red to blue. It's also someone who goes from voter to not voter. So as we address this climate crisis, I implore you all to help make those non-voters voter. Let's help swing this direction in a way that we can positively come together as a community and make this impact. This is on us. 2020 is on us. Climate change and the ability to deal with these global issues is on us. So I hope that you guys will join. I hope that you guys will take these steps in your own community to make this impact. And thank you guys so much for being here, because this is what it's about.
Are you focusing on the swing states like Ohio and Michigan and Wisconsin and Georgia and Pennsylvania?
Yeah, it is essential that as we get out the vote, we have to realize that these swing districts are, our democracy sort of works in this funny way where, what is it? It's like one person in Iowa is worth like 1,000 people in California. Just these very skewed numbers in terms of what representation means, and these sort of larger voter systems need change across the board. And yeah, it's essential to do this work in these swing districts. We have a lot of partners working on the ground in these swing districts, and so if we can get them, and particularly the youth in these places, out to vote, sometimes an election is determined by like a couple of votes. Like there have been elections that have been swung by literally one vote. And so if we can scale this up, there's a literal +1 that could make that difference.
Are you connected with Stacey Abrams, who has a voter suppression program nationwide, who really should be the governor of Georgia right now?
Yeah, absolutely. So Stacey Abrams is sort of one of my heroes. And Stacey, for those of you guys who don't know, she ran in a very competitive race for governor in Georgia last year. And the reason she lost was essentially voter suppression. So seeing the government there taking thousands of people after voter registration rolls, making it so that when people will come to the polls, they wouldn't be able to vote, making it so that lines for the polls would just go hours and hours long in Black and brown communities, making it so that those people of color can't vote. A sort of new Jim Crow, a sort of new disenfranchisement of Black people just shrouded in other policies. And I think that this is deplorable. And Stacey should be governor of Georgia right now. And so we've been in contact with some people there. And she right now has formed, I think it's called Fair Fight Action, which is this national organization that is deploying teams of sort of people that are on call to help fight and take cases in terms of voter registration. So even the other day we saw like 200,000 people being removed from the voter rolls in Wisconsin. And so, this is a case for Stacey and other groups as well. So hopefully as we go through this election cycle, especially seeing what happened in the last cycle, and I think now having this understanding of voter disenfranchisement, and voter suppression, that there will be more on-the-ground efforts to deal with those, as well as voter turnout. And in an ideal scenario, were we to win the election, then we could reform a lot of these policies and ensure that it doesn't happen again. At the end of the day, I think politicians should not be choosing their voters. voters should be choosing their politicians. So hopefully we can live in a country where that happens.
I'm going to give you a wild card.
Yeah,
It's on.
it's on.
A wild-eyed idea. Talking to us basically gets you quarter of the point. You can get 10,000 points by talking to a Democratic billionaire like Steyer or Bloomberg, who's running for president.
I can't hear it.
Okay, Steyer or Bloomberg, who are running for president, who want more voters. As far as I know, there was a referendum in Florida allowing over 1 million former felons to get the vote back. The Florida state legislature and the governor said, we don't like that. So even though they served out their term, if they owe a $200 of court costs or a $1,000 fine, we will not let them vote. So one or both of the Democratic billionaires said, okay, we will pay the fines and the court costs to any Florida citizen who's unable to vote, Republican, Democrat, or independent. Obviously, there'd probably be a strong tilt to the Democrats. That's why the Republicans took it away. So how about that way to add 1 million voters to a purple state? Is that totally crazy or only half crazy?
I mean, I love the idea. I don't understand why we live in a country where after you've served your sentence, after you've served your time, that you are now ineligible to vote. Isn't the idea of going to prison that you have to sort of reform your thought process and become more, rehabilitated into society? Isn't that the point, right? Like, that's what I assumed prison was supposed to be, to sort of get people in a different mind space when they come out. But instead we see prisons being used as sort of torture chambers, as profit-producing facilities. And then we get these prisoners coming out and stripping away their ability to have any sort of representation in the process that only they know so intimately. And so I absolutely think that everyone who has formerly been incarcerated should have the right to vote. And when we're looking at the situation in Florida, the voter suppression that you highlighted is it's astounding that happened and that got such national media attention, and still just policy after policy, or roadblock after roadblock, we're still seeing that people aren't being given the right to vote. And so, if someone wanted to go in and rectify that situation, why not? Bill, Tom, are you watching?
Question, please.
Good morning.
Hello, good
Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
I have more like a comment and my feelings about this.
We're looking for questions, please.
Okay, my question is, like, for example, the enemy, we have one enemy. The press is our enemy. The other day I left a message for my congresswoman. We need more education. They cannot just stop by the meetings, the local meetings, many of them, different organizations, and just exit. Oh, we have another place to go. Then we're not getting educated. We're not getting informed. The media is not informing us. So how are we going to fight this? And I also hear that the U.S. is given the most pressure in terms of global change, but other countries don't face the same pressure. I might be wrong, so please correct me if I'm wrong.
I think that in many ways, America has traditionally served as a leader in a lot of spaces. But what we're seeing is that as time is going by and as America is becoming less ambitious in the scale of its policies, or is changing its priorities entirely, that America is falling back. I think America used to be sort of the hub for education, #1 in the world. It's where everyone wanted to go. It's why my parents immigrated here, so that I and my brothers would have the opportunity to have this sort of quality education. And now we're seeing America slip back as our policies for education, K through 12, are defined from policies from the 60s, but have received very little change in terms of the way that we define them. And so I think, we'll even see at the UN, Trump will come and speak, and ambassadors and leaders of the world just laugh. And so we're sort of losing that America is this sort of land of the free and sort of global focal point. And as we've been seeing, now other nations and other entities are taking the lead on climate. We're seeing that other places are becoming better for education. And so it's sort of this catch-22 of we need change to happen, but in order for change to happen, there has to be change. And so it's kind of complex. In terms of your local issues, I'm sorry that your representatives are not getting back to you. I think that our politicians need to be accountable to their local constituents, and I would urge you to keep calling, keep showing up, and I think that one of the greatest things that people can do is organize. So, bring together your community members, and when you show up and you're like, hey, it's me and my voice, but it's also my community and our voices, then you become more powerful, and they really have no choice but to really sit down and take what you have much more seriously.
I've been calling the White House for 5 months to get information. It's very flimsy, very dismissive. Sometimes the operators, they're not cooperative.
Yeah.
It shouldn't take that long to do.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.